Dear students, welcome once again to Army Public School PMA Resource Network. Students, before we start our today's subject, please subscribe this page and click on the bell icon to receive notifications of our upcoming videos. Students, we are going to read subject Science and chapter number is 4. The name of chapter is States of Matter, Melting and Freezing. Students, textbook page number is 59. So students, now let's start our today's lecture. Dear students, now we are going to discuss about unit number 4 of the book, and the name of this chapter is States of Matter. Students, here we have some simple learning objectives or learning outcomes of today's topic. So students will be able to know or describe 3 different forms of matter. Then they will describe the changes in liquids and solids when they are heated or cooled. Afterwards, students will be able to know or differentiate between temporary and permanent changes. And in the last, students will explain all these important points through different experiments. So these are our today's learning objectives of the lecture. So students, now here we are going to define the first point of our today's lecture. As we know, the name of chapter is States of Matter. So students, in this regard, we have to define the definition of matter. What is matter? Matter is anything around us. It means, it shows that anything which is existing around us is called matter. So matter is anything which has mass and occupies space is called matter. Students, on Earth, matter is usually found in one of 3 states. So these 3 main states of matter are solid, liquid, and the last state of any matter is gas. Students, in this slide, now we are going to discuss different states of matter or different states of water. Here we have example of water. Students, we have 3 different diagrams in this slide. In diagram number 1, we have physical states of water. That is first one, solid state, then liquid state, and in the last we have gas state. Now we are going to define chemical states of water. Students, if we discuss the chemical state of water in solid form, here we can observe that the particles of this state are very closely packed. There is no distance or gap among the particles of this state. In liquid state, we can observe there is little bit space among the particles of this state. And in gas state, there is huge distance or gap among the particles of gas state. So, the arrangement of these particles can define the shape of that substance. So, students, after description of different states of any matter through different diagrams, now we are going to define the basic definitions of solid, liquid, and gas. Students, first of all, we will describe the definition of solid. What is solid? Solid is the simplest state of matter. Solid has a definite shape, mass, and volume. Now, what is liquid? Liquid is the most fluid and ever changing state of matter. It does not have a definite shape but have definite mass and volume. Students, here we can observe the basic change between these two definitions of solid and liquid. In solid, we can say that it has a definite shape, mass, and volume. But in liquid, it does not have a definite shape. So it is the basic difference between solid and liquid state. So now what is gas? Gas is the most complex form of any matter. A gas does not have a proper shape, volume, and mass. So any gas doesn't have any proper or definite shape, definite volume, and mass. Students, in this slide, now we are going to define different effects of heating and cooling process over different materials. We will observe that what happens with different materials when they are heated or cooled down. So now we will define all these effects briefly. Students, now we are going to define different effects of heating or cooling process over different materials. What happens when materials are heated or cooled? Students, we will define these changes through a chart. Here we have three different columns in this chart. In first column we have different materials. In second, we will observe all those changes which happens after heating or cooling process. And in last, we will discuss whether these changes are permanent or temporary. Students, the first material we have is paper. When we burn a piece of paper, it changes into ash. And this change is a permanent change. Students, it is not possible to convert back ashes into a piece of paper. So that's why we can say that this change is a permanent change. Second material we have is wood. What happens when wood is heated? Students, wood will be changed into ash, and again this change is a permanent change. It is not possible to convert back ashes into wood. The third material we have is water. What happens when water is cooled down? Students, water changes into ice, and this change is temporary change. We can convert back ice into water. So that's why we can say that this change is temporary or reversible change. And the last example or material we have is wax. Students, when wax is heated, it will change into melted form. But that change is temporary change. When this wax is cooled down, it will again change into its original form. So that's why we can say that it is a temporary change. So these are different effects of cooling or heating process over different materials. So students, now we are going to define the changes which we observe in different materials when these materials are heated or cooled. Some materials or objects changes its physical states when heated or cooled them. Here we have two types of changes. The first one we have is permanent or irreversible or not change back change. The second we have is temporary or reversible or change back. So in our next slide we will define these changes briefly. So students, now we are going to discuss the different effects of cooling and heating process over different materials. Students, we will define these effects through different examples. So in example number 1 we have when a piece of paper burns, it forms ashes when it is heated. Students, when a piece of paper is burned, it converts into ashes. But that ashes are not possible to convert back or change back into original piece of paper. The second example is water turns into ice when it is cooled. Students, when water is cooled down at very low temperature, it is converted into ice form. So these are the different effects of cooling and heating process over different materials. Students, the next point of today's lecture is what are permanent, irreversible, and temporary or reversible changes. Students, we will define permanent and temporary changes through different examples. So, some changes are permanent or irreversible. This means that the material that has undergone changes cannot return to its original form. That's why it is called permanent change. In this way, new substance is formed because of the change. When paper burns, in result, permanently paper changes in ash, and this process is irreversible. Ash is a new substance. It cannot be changed back to the original piece of paper. Here we have example of a piece of paper which burns, and in result we can observe that it totally changes in ash. So this process is irreversible because this is not possible to change back this ash into paper piece. Students, now we are going to define lecture of week 10. Subject is science and topic of the week is permanent and temporary changes in materials. So students, we will discuss all permanent or irreversible and temporary or reversible changes in detail. Students, in our previous slide, we have discussed about permanent or irreversible change. Now we are going to define temporary or reversible changes on different materials. Students, we will define it through an example. Students, here we have example of water. Water turns into ice when it is cooled. In this picture, students, we can observe when water is cooled or freezed, it is converted into ice form. But it is possible to convert back or reversible ice into water form. So that's why it is called a temporary or reversible change of any material. Students, now in this slide we are going to define another very important point, which is about temporary or reversible materials. We will discuss about temporary or reversible materials which are possible to change back into original form. So some changes are temporary. We have example of gold. When solid gold heated in a furnace at a very high temperature becomes liquid gold. When liquid gold is cooled, it changes back to solid gold. So here we have explanation of this example through diagram. In diagram number 1, we have solid form of gold. Students, when we try to heat solid gold at a very high temperature, it is converted into liquid form. But when this gold is cooled down, again it is converted into solid form from liquid. So it proves that some processes are temporary or reversible, and it is possible to convert back the materials into original form. So now we are going to discuss about what happens when solids and liquids are heated or cooled. Students, we will observe that after heating or cooling process, how the state of any material changes into other form. As we know, matter has three physical states, which are solid state, liquid state, and the last one is gas state. Students, heating and cooling can change the state of any matter. It can change a solid into a liquid when it is heated. Students, here we have example of a solid chocolate bar. When this chocolate bar is heated, it turns into liquid form. So it shows that after heating process, a solid state of any material changed into liquid state. Students, now here we are going to define another very important point of the lecture, which is what is melting. Students, we will define the basic definition of melting and try to explain it through an example. Melting is the process by which a solid changes into a liquid. This change takes place when the solid gains heat. Here we have example of water. When water is in ice form and it starts to convert from ice cube to melted form, then we can say it is melting of that material. Students, now what is melting point? The temperature at which a solid melts is known its melting point. Students, when water starts melt from ice form to water form, so that exact point is called melting point. Example is the melting point of ice is 0 degree centigrade. So it is called melting point of ice. Students, in this slide now we are going to discuss or to define another very important point of today's lecture, and that is freezing. What is freezing? Freezing is the process by which a liquid changes into a solid. Freezing process takes place when the liquid loses heat. Freezing is the reverse of melting. Students, here we have example of water. In freezing process, water starts to freeze from liquid state to solid state by cooling. So now what is freezing point? The temperature at which a liquid freezes is known as its freezing point. Water starts to freeze when its temperature reaches 0 degrees centigrade. So in this way, the freezing point of water is 0 degrees centigrade. Students, now in this slide, we are going to describe melting and freezing points of some materials. Students, we will discuss about different melting and freezing points of different materials. Here we have a chart. So in this chart, we have some materials, their melting and freezing points. So the first material is water. The melting point of water is 0 degrees centigrade and the freezing point of water is 0 degrees centigrade. The second material is canola oil. Students, melting point of canola oil is 14 degrees centigrade. And again, freezing point of this oil is 14 degrees centigrade. Butter. The melting point of butter is 32 degrees centigrade. And freezing point of butter is 35 degrees centigrade. Now we have pure gold. The melting point of pure gold is very high, which is 1945 degrees centigrade. And the freezing point of pure gold is 1945 degrees centigrade. And the last material of this chart is iron. The melting point of iron is 2802 degrees centigrade and freezing point of iron is 2802 degrees centigrade. So students, these were the different melting and freezing points of different materials, and it shows that any material has different melting and freezing point from others. Students, now this is our last slide of today's lecture, and here we have an assignment which you have to attempt on loose sheets. Students, here we have some simple questions and all students have to answer these questions in simple words on loose sheets. In question number 1, we have describe and list some other materials which change permanently or temporarily from your daily life when they are cooled or heated. Question number 2. Describe definitions of permanent, irreversible, and temporary reversible changes of materials, and list any five examples. The last question is perform and solve the activities on textbook page number 63 and 64 at home and write answers on loose sheets.